One of the neatest things about trucking is the relationships that you build with people, sometimes short term, but oftentimes really, really, really long term. And, that was one of the things that Mr. Johnston was especially good at. And certainly, you guys have seen, heard a lot about the early times, and it's hard, one of the greatest experiences you can have, the learning lessons you can have, is really to experience hard times. And one of the best teachers you can have is hard times. And realistically, a whole bunch of folks, in fact, maybe even the majority, certainly not all that many years ago, learned virtually everything the hard way, oftentimes experiencing the hard times. Certainly, just getting into trucking, lots and lots and lots of ways to get skinned. And certainly, there's no better, once you get skinned good, that's a pretty good lesson that you don't want to do that again. You may not know what to do, but you don't want to do that again. As has been mentioned, Johnston's goal certainly wasn't to start an organization. He liked trucking. He liked it. His like or love for trucking never did really diminish, in that every opportunity he had, he'd get behind the wheel. And he liked to go fast. He liked to go fast. One of the first things that I did after I met Jim in 1976, and we were at a local restaurant. I was just fortunate enough to have lived and grown up in Oak Grove, where the office was at the time. And we were at a restaurant, and one of the guys in the restaurant recognized me because of a political button I was wearing and started giving me a bunch of grief. This was 1976. And in 1976, I had a Ronald Reagan button on. And this is all coming off the heels of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and there were really, really lots of, and Arab oil embargoes and all kinds of turmoil. And one of the folks that were actually there with Jim started giving me a bunch of grief, and one of the other guys there with him said, "Hey, that's a member?" God, Johnston sprung into action and said, "You shut up and get away from me." Because then, certainly every trucker was important, but believe me, members were really, really, really precious. And as was said earlier, Johnston, whether he was, probably too stubborn to quit, probably wasn't accurate. He did believe that he would continue to pursue furthering the interests of truckers if it consumed him completely. And certainly there were hard times there, and it took forever and ever and ever for the organization to get above 1,000 members. Woody mentioned when we sued it was the Public Service Commission in Tennessee. It was 1991 when that happened. Actually 15 years after the OOIDA was formed, and we still only had a few thousand members. And ironically, if you knew what all was involved, you wouldn't take any steps at all. We certainly didn't then, but Johnston said it's the right thing to do, and it happened because we would hear from truckers repeatedly over and over and over that, they're demanding to search our trucks as what they call an inspection in Tennessee, demanding to search our trucks, and if you object, if you give away your constitutional rights, they'll write you a ticket, take you to jail. And some guy said, well, those are attitude tickets. Guys are just coming in there starting trouble. No, they weren't all attitude tickets. Probably, look, if somebody put me in a situation like that, and probably a number of they might very well, an attitude ticket might result. But no, these were just clearly instances where enforcement, under the guise of safety, just took advantage of the truckers that they could. That was what that suit was over. But we didn't find out till much later that, the goal in Tennessee was, this is how they raised political funds for the Public Service Commission. They, by simply shaking down little guys. And we also didn't, we didn't know that going in. We also found out later on that, hey, all the big carriers basically paid. They didn't get messed with because they paid. The organization was set up virtually from the beginning to stand up and fight for the rights of truckers because, Johnston was there on the road. He experienced things firsthand. He hauled refrigerated stuff, the lumping crap, all of that stuff he dealt with. Lots of the regulations were somewhat easier then, but there were also more and more blatant ways you can get skinned. And the early goals of the organization were just largely about making things right for the day. Probably the magic that has made the organization last is it was always about the people that it represents. It was always about people behind the wheel. There were 250 other organizations that started at the time, or started about then, and there's been, dozens that have come along since, and when things get rough, or things get crazy, or really just bizarre, and, they will frequently, you have folks say, well, look, I've got a better idea, and those guys don't know what they're doing, and da-da-da-da-da, and they do that. They make some noise, they get some attention, and OOIDA started from those very same types of ideas and emotions. Jim wasn't OOIDA's first president, it wasn't his second. First president was a company driver. Company drivers have always been part of OOIDA. The company driver in this case was J.W. River Rat Edwards. He had a knack. He had a specialty. His specialty was really, really stirring stuff up. Really stirring stuff up. Putting trucks across the road. But what he didn't have a knack at was actually resolving anything. It isn't any great accomplishment just to stir stuff up. You have to have a plan for afterward how you put things back together. Mr. Johnston had a plan, and he realized that if the organization was going to be successful, like-minded individuals would have to buy into that plan. And of course, the like-minded individuals were truckers. OOIDA's board of directors was set up from the beginning to be filled by truckers. You have to be a real one, not accountant, not an attorney, none of that other stuff. You have to be a trucker to get on the board. You have to be a trucker to be an officer, and that's where you have to come from. And the idea was to always keep it pure, and the idea was also the realization and the recognition that while not everybody can do everything, There are people within the truck community behind the wheel that have the capability to do almost anything. And we've realized that through the years. One of OOIDA's first goals was to address the situation that Jim talked about himself, in that here he can take a truck to a driver license agency and become certified to drive all over any kind of equipment all over the country without having any real knowledge of knowing what you're doing at all. It's been one of the biggest issues in trucking for a whole lot of decades now. Something that OOIDA was pushing actually in the 1980s. In the 1980s, OOIDA was instrumental in creating the Professional Truck Driver Institute. It lives today, the original, and it lives. Jim was the chairman of the board, the very first one. And we had a number of directors that actually were key to putting together the curriculum for that driver training. The association, PTDI, it was then A, it exists today, but it's never, while the key there is to increase the professionalism and the quality, it's the greatest improvement that you can make overall in trucking. It's something that OOIDA and Johnston always realized and embraced. However, it's still not something that is broadly embraced by others in the trucking community. It needs to be sorely, because you fix the bottom. And when you say fix the bottom, that's training, that's improving professionalism. It also means improving pay and benefits and things like that. Those are the things that actually will create real improvements in trucking. Economics change through the years to sometimes make that more achievable, but we have a driver training rule that's in FMCSA now that we have to push them to get out. That was one of the goals that Johnston had and early members had, and we're just about there. The other lesson you learn along the way is anything really worth having, more than likely it's going to take a long time to get. So, going to take a long time to get. Jim recognized that having the ability to play the long game was going to be important. He realized that relationships were important. People in DC, elected officials, you've heard from any number, they ever met Jim, ever got acquainted with him, what he was known for, his sincerity. He believed the things that he said. He was always proud of the people that he represented. And he believed that making the investments right there would be the greatest thing that could happen. And whenever even people on other sides of issues, and there are some names like Joan Claybrook and things like that, well, they may not have always agreed with the things that he said, they always respected him for his ability to actually represent the people that OOIDA is built with and built about. And one of the things that Johnston said is that wherever you go, make certain that people know who you represent, and always be mindful that those people that you represent are listening to what you're saying too. You make them proud. You don't make them embarrassed. That's my representative, and I'm going to be proud. And that's the philosophy he kind of instilled in the organization. Again, I mentioned the heart of it is its board of directors. The heart of it is its bylaws that addresses. So OOIDA will always be pure. He believed that if you want to know something, If you want to know something, experience it firsthand. I said he loved to drive. That love to drive never went away. Woody mentioned that trip, one of the last, well, I won't say one of the last trips, but one of the most memorable trips he made. He and I took the Spirit truck to Atlanta. And Jim was part of, he was part of what was the first Federal Motor Carrier Safety Advisory Committee, and we went to Atlanta because the Secretary of Transportation had invited us there for an event. It was kind of an interesting trip for lots of reasons, but I can tell you that, you know, beyond just the sheer love of driving, that's when Johnson, and this goes back to, what do you say, 2002? 2002, we're driving from Kansas City to Atlanta, and we're still on the old hours of service regulations, and we're logging. I was a whole lot closer to accurate than he was. Which I said, Jim, you know, yours is supposed to match mine. You can't just, but that's kind of another story. I guess I'm going to say it's probably a good thing we're two-man, because this is real time, first time, no place in a rest area to park. Basically all the way from St. Louis to Atlanta, no place in a rest area to stop. They're all full, and this is a long time ago, and they were full previous to that. So that was his big takeaway, and basically that became a major initiative then. But, you know, continuing that trip, I'm reminded that we did go through Cincinnati. Steve was in Cincinnati. We did the show that night. Bozo was actually at his place that night in Florida. But the curious thing about Bozo's show, Jim was on it previously, late night, middle of the night, when we were in the middle of our issue with the Public Service Commission in Tennessee. Bozo set up this idea that it would be great to have Jim Johnston and Keith Bissell, the head of the Public Service Commission, on his show to debate directly. The only thing was, Keith Bissell went to the show. Jim did it from our office in Grain Valley via phone. And when he learned, boy, that was a big mistake, because being able to communicate face to face versus over the phone, where you could be muted, Bozo would mute him. He'd be screaming in the office, and Bozo and Bissell would have the forum. He never made that mistake twice. The next time that happened, Jim made sure he was in the studio. He was in the studio too. You learn from your mistakes. Didn't make many, but there were a few. There will be a few more, I'm sure, going forward. But that's all part of the process. And if your goals are right, and they've always been, you hope things will work right, provided you've got the diligence. You know, through the years, the association has grown quite a bit. Why it's not bigger beats the heck out of me. I can tell you that it was Jim's, when OOIDA was formed, membership was $90 a year. Some years later, we dropped it to $45. Jim wanted to do everything he could to eliminate any kind of barrier to somebody to join, because again, everybody, probably every person in this room and every person in this whole show knows that if truckers were just together, nothing would be off the table. But for some reason we're not. It was his goal to change that. He never faulted the truckers themselves, never faulted the drivers themselves. It was just simply our message. Our message has to get better. And it's gotten better through the years. Our ability to represent has gotten better through the years, to advocate for the rights of drivers, and actually to address the issues that would never be addressed by anyone else. You know, we mentioned the Public Service Commission with Bristol and Tennessee. No other entity on this planet would have taken them on. That would have gone on forever. Most of the regulations, you know, you learn early on that while people may growl about regulations, if you're big enough, actually, they're not really, I mean, they can actually be an impediment to your competition. And we see that play out now with so many regulations that come out of FMCSA, but it's always been that way. When the association was formed, it wasn't uncommon to have a truck to have 3 or 4 or 5, even a half a dozen license plates across the front. The licensing, the regulatory barriers were just total impediments to truckers. And OOIDA addressed that issue. We pushed for it through the entities that were open at the time. We did that with the board of directors. Jim knew that was an impediment. So we pushed for it. And it took, you know, realistically, it took 18 years to actually get that changed. So you gotta be ready for the long game. You gotta set up the structure, you know, creating programs, things like that gives truckers a voice that will sustain. And that will sustain and keep going. With the governments, you know, we all deal with the drug testing program that Woody mentioned earlier. Curious, if you want to know how things came about, the government drug testing program wasn't the first one that was pushed by the big guys. What the big guys wanted, and when I say big guys, I'm talking about ATA and big carriers, they wanted drug testing, but they wanted cops doing it. They wanted cops doing it on the roadside. And to make that a reality, they created a program that wasn't the FMCSA then, but it was sort of like the predecessor agency where they pooled $5 million. Let's go out and get some states to do this. And they did. They found 4 states that would split those $5 million to agree to randomly roadside drug test truck drivers. You talk about having your rights taken away, stripped completely. And not either one, those states had to agree they could do it and they could do it legally. Could they? Hell no, they couldn't then. Under Johnston's leadership, we challenged that nonsense. And while we didn't get that case thrown out in the courts, mainly because in so many instances, they can run the clock out on you. It was a pilot program. The pilot program ended before the court had avoided making a decision. So they could get away with saying, well, the issue's moot because they don't do it anymore. But the curious thing about it is, who would stand up? Carriers told their drivers, if you say no to one of those tests, you're fired. Only person that stood up was OOIDA, and the only one. And that was Johnston. He was the president. It's largely been that way ever since. Hopefully it won't always be that way, but I can tell you, OOIDA will always be there to make certain, and we'll do everything we can to assure and fight for the rights of drivers. That was built into the organization from day one, and it's something that we continue to pursue until, I'm going to say, I'd say the last day, but certainly until the last driver is gone, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your support of the organization, and I believe I've said enough.